You don't have a machine. She would want to be out. She wants to be on. I have two doors. I live. My favorite thing is to sometimes close my door. Nobody. Every time I close the door, it's because I and it's massive. It's so much done.
I go one over it and have to crash.
I'm with the boat. I'm still working on it.
Right up your house.
Yeah.
This is kind of doing it. Correct.
I don't want to cook anything, but I would like to cook
Not quite.
I don't know that much, Brian.
Yeah. I don't really want this.
Well, I picked it because it's the biggest. And it's really good. It's gingerbread. It's got a little. They're really good. Yeah.
Yeah. Not going up there, I hear a lot. But I don't know. I mean, I think you're here, but places I know, but. Yeah.
There are some clubs around that transparency. I know I'm not smart enough. Mine is the
We actually use that since you Burns Park, so there you go. Trades like mostly lists.
Have you ever used a day trade like that?
I think.
Yeah. Like talking with.
Yeah, but.
Hey everybody, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. I know it's a cold and dreary day. I'm Danielle Absorda. I'm the Community Outreach Archivist and Programs Coordinator for the Cowles Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. Welcome to Legacies and Lunch, the Politics of Public Health, Lessons from Hot Springs, Arkansas. This monthly program is currently being held at UA Little Rock downtown. Thanks to Marta and Carly for graciously hosting us, but we will be moving back to Cowles Main Library in January of 2026 to the Dara Center on the 5th floor. So we hope to see you there just across Library Square. If you're joining us in person today and you parked in library parking, you can get that parking validated at the table in the front. And there are also cookies and drinks at that table, so I hope you'll get some of those. And there was a raffle, so I hope you got a raffle ticket. I'm going to do a little drawing. The last three numbers on the ticket are 192. Awesome. We wrote things. So we've got a Butler Center tote, and inside is the Main Street Arkansas book with lots of great photos from main streets across Arkansas.
That's rare. Thank you.
Thank you.
More rare in business.
And there will be another raffle at the end for another tote bag and a copy of Dr. Bowen's book that he'll be talking about today. And I just have one programming update from the Butler Center. We're going to invite you to join us for Second Friday Art Night on Friday, December 12th from 5 to 8 p.m. We are returning to the Cowles Roberts Library, so we hope to see you there. It's just across the Rock Street here. And we'll have a used book sale in conjunction with that, free screen printing and holiday photos, as well as music by DJ Swift 720. Should be a fun time. And this is all made possible by generous funding from the Cowles Foundation and the Wingate Foundation. For today's Legacies and Lunch, we're joined virtually by Elliott Bowen and in person by Tim Nutt. Dr. Bowen is a historian of medicine and public health. His research interests center on the history of sexually transmitted disease, and more broadly on the history of gender and sexuality in the modern United States. He received his PhD from Binghamton University in 2013, and is currently researcher, writer, and communications director at Nology. a nonprofit organization that produces practical social science to drive positive change. Since joining Knology, he has contributed to numerous peer-reviewed publications that focus on libraries and museums. Though no longer in academia, he maintains an active role as an independent scholar, having recently authored studies of the World Health Organization's campaign against syphilis and the history of efforts to reduce the stigma associated with this and other sexually transmitted diseases. And Tim Nutt is currently employed as professor and director of the Historical Research Center at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. Previously, he was employed in special collections at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville as the manuscripts and rare books librarian, and later as the head of the department. Prior to his University of Arkansas work, he was the founding deputy curator of the Cowles Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, and he co-created and served as the founding managing editor and staff historian of the award-winning Encyclopedia of Arkansas that you may be familiar with. Dr. Bowen will explore how moral norms shaped early 20th century public health in Hot Springs, and after he shared a bit of historical context, he'll be joined at the podium by Tim to connect this history to Arkansas's broader public health story. If you have questions and you're joining us via Zoom, please put those in the chat, and we will alternate in-person and virtual questions at the end of the Q&A with Tim. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bowen virtually and Tim in person. Thanks.
Thank you, Danielle, for that warm welcome, and hello to everyone. As she said, my name is Elliott Bowen, and I am the author of this slim little volume called In Search of Sexual Health, Diagnosing and Treating Syphilis in Hot Springs, Arkansas, 1890 to 1940. The title of the book, In Search of Sexual Health, is a reference to the popular practice of health seeking, which was incredibly common in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and even continues today. If you're familiar with the terms medical tourism or health tourism, it is very much the same concept, just kind of on a more global stage. In the period that I was researching, late 19th, early 20th century, the most well-known examples of health tourism were for respiratory ailments, for example, asthma, hay fever, etc., and of course, most famously, tuberculosis, like the infamous lungers, whose search for naturopathic cures shaped the emergence of a lot of cities in the western part of the US, including places like Denver and Tucson. Syphilis, as I came to find from my research, was another one of those diseases that people at the time, in the pre-antibiotic era, often went out on the road to in search of cures for. It was something that I first became aware of by reading letters like this. This is kind of the opening vignette of the book. It's a letter from 1897 in which an individual from Virginia named G.W. Banks, you can read the quote here on the screen, is talking to a friend of his about how all syphilitics go to hot springs, where the hot water soaks the mercury into them. And he also has a joke here about how he wouldn't want it published if it was in his newspaper that two of these people had gone down to hot springs for that purpose. It was encountering correspondence like this that kind of first got me interested in researching the history of hot springs and particularly its relationship with syphilis. And lo and behold, out of that eventually came this book, which is basically about the interactions between individuals and medical institutions. The book is really a study of people's experiences with early 20th century medical and public health systems as they attempted to obtain treatment for syphilis. And the book is the story of how, in the process of receiving medical care, these people looking for cures both shaped and were shaped by the country's therapeutic infrastructure. One of the things that I found again and again in the early stages of my research is that a lot of people talked about this at the time, particularly in medical journals. There are a lot of references to, from the mid-19th century onward, people from all across the country flocking to this one place, this emerging health resort of Hot Springs, Arkansas, to be treated specifically for syphilis. As you can see from some of these quotes on the screen here, it quickly acquired a reputation as the therapeutic destination of choice for people with this one particular malady. And so that drove a lot of my early research, and the wealth of information that I found over time enabled me to kind of produce a book-length account of Hot Springs' ongoing relationship with syphilis over the course of about 5 decades. This was a time from the 1890s really through the 1940s when the city was known as the Mecca of the American syphilitic, on account of the thousands of people with syphilis who traveled there every year looking for cures. Over time, what I found through my research is that the therapeutic journeys of these individuals had a profound impact on Hot Springs' development. Over time, what emerged in the city was a vast medical infrastructure solely devoted to syphilis. You can see that beginning in the late 19th century with the emergence of the city's bathhouses and the bathhouse healing industry, a lot of which was devoted to curing people with this one particular ailment. Later on, as we move forward into the early 1900s, the federal government itself became more and more actively involved in this emerging medical infrastructure, not just through the establishment of the Hot Springs Army and Navy General Hospital, which you can see from the quote here on the screen, admitted a lot of former and sometimes current servicemen with syphilis. But also a little bit later in the 1920s and 30s, the establishment of the first free public venereal disease clinic anywhere in the US, which was run from 1921 to 1936 by the Public Health Service venereologist Oliver Wenger, who, in one of his more candid moments, remarked on how, to the average layman, Hot Springs, Arkansas means VD, and VD means Hot Springs. So again, this was a very well-known place to go for the treatment of syphilis, basically from the 1890s through the invention of penicillin in the 1940s, around the time of the Second World War. And so as I discovered more and more of these sites of clinical care for syphilis patients, I became increasingly interested in trying to figure out what their experiences were like. The research questions that I began this journey with, and which I take up at length in the book, are very basic and fundamental. I nevertheless felt that they were very important to ask because we don't actually know a lot historically about the experiences of people with syphilis. We know a lot about the opinions of doctors. We know a lot about the types of therapies and diagnostic tools that were available at the time. But we're still kind of trying to figure out historically what it was to live with this disease, what it meant to have syphilis in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was really get at patients' lived experiences, and to the extent that I could, tell a story that really foregrounded the perspectives of those individuals who came to Hot Springs, wherever they came from, however long they were there. I wanted to know what happened to them in the course of their therapeutic journeys, and I wanted to know about the impact of their experiences more broadly, either within Hot Springs itself or in terms of the country's broader struggles with sexually transmitted illness. So that's kind of the foundation for the book itself and the questions that I'm answering. One of the things that was important for me to try to do, given the existing scholarship on this topic, was to kind of decenter the role of the federal government and of elite medical associations in the story of syphilis. There is no shortage of historical research on syphilis. As some of the examples you see on the screen here indicate, we have studies, a lot of studies of the Tuskegee syphilis study. We have general accounts of American responses to VD in the modern era. We also have a lot of books and articles that focus on wartime experiences with VD, particularly the First and Second World Wars. And in a lot of those accounts, the central player is often presented to be the federal government, either through the public health service or through the military. And those are great stories that tell us a lot about the way that people at the top understood syphilis and were attempting to respond to it. But I wanted to do something that was a little bit different, that was a little bit closer to the ground. I wanted to know about syphilis patients themselves and the doctors that they sought out treatment from. Because so much of the scholarship treats the public health service as the key actor in this story, I wanted to try to flip the script a little bit and see how do things look from the other side, not just the perspective of federal officials or medical elites, but from the perspective of everyday people with syphilis and the individuals they sought care for. And fortunately, I found that I was able to do that by uncovering a lot of interesting source material. And that includes patient narratives. As much as I could, I tried to base my research on accounts left by people at the time who experienced syphilis and traveled to hot springs from all across the country and left some kind of record of what happened to them while they were there. For example, in the first chapter of the book, I'm really giving a narrative of one person's experience. That individual you can see on the screen here, his name was Archie Cowles. He came to Hot Springs twice in 1905 and 1907. He was originally from Cleveland. And while he was in Hot Springs, he had a lengthy correspondence with friends and relatives back home. Another type of patient narrative that I take up, this is another individual who came to Hot Springs around the same time, but this individual was from Florida and also left a record of what was happening to him while he was there. And this excerpt on the screen here is just one quote from his letters and also some diaries that talks about the very difficult time that he had receiving treatment. This is an individual that eventually died by suicide in Hot Springs, and whose story I chronicle in the second chapter of the book. In addition to patient narratives, that is correspondence between people with syphilis and loved ones, I was also fortunate in my research to be able to unearth a lot of personal accounts in federal archives, letters that were sent, by individuals to the federal government. Here's an example on the screen here. Again, an individual who traveled to Arkansas from far away, this time Clovis, New Mexico, in 1934. In this case, as you can see from the quote on the screen, writing directly to the president at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, talking about how they had been struggling with syphilis for years and very much wanted to obtain treatment at Hot Springs and to be able to stay there long enough to get a cure. So these kinds of first person accounts of syphilis are really at the core of the story that I'm trying to tell. In addition to patient narratives, another great source of information that I came across are clinical case files, particularly in the chapter of the book that I have that is focused on the Army and Navy General Hospital. There are patient files, they're clinical records that talk about the experiences of former servicemen who contracted syphilis at some point in the past and then came to Hot Springs for treatment. There's just one example on the screen here of an individual who was treated in 1907 for the disease, particularly at the Army and Navy Hospital. So after researching and analyzing all of this data, this patient-centered data, I came to find that these individuals, many of whom are, unknown, everyday people, actually had a big impact on the way that doctors, public health officials, and medical institutions writ large were responding to syphilis. In many cases, I found that it was actually the actions and the circumstances of these people that was driving the way that the broader society thought about and interacted with syphilis on a clinical level. And I also found, in addition to that, that individual actors within Hot Springs itself, for example, the residents of the town at the time, had a big impact on the way that both the city and the broader country were dealing with this venereal disease epidemic at the time. And again, the value I thought in doing that is to show that it's not always the federal government or the people in charge of key medical or public health institutions who are calling the shots. Sometimes it is actually patients who are in the driver's seat and collectively, even in an indirect fashion sometimes, influencing the way that society responds to these diseases. And so I just wanted to share before we open up the discussion, just kind of one particular example of that coming from closer to the end of the book, relatively well-known example of the Hot Springs Venereal Disease Clinic, which, as I said before, was run by Oliver C. Wenger, a public health service employee, one of the leading venereologists at the time. Over the course of his tenure, as the director of the Free Hot Springs VD Clinic, uh, more than 60,000 patients were admitted into this clinic where they received treatment. Men as well as women, rich as well as poor, black as well as white. And as you can see here from this graph on the screen, the clinic's caseload uh, increased rather significantly with the passage of time, particularly after the onset of the Great Depression in 1929. What's interesting about Wenger that I found in my research is that he came to Hot Springs. He arrived there in 1921 with a very kind of traditional perspective on the disease. Like a lot of leading medical authorities at the time, he had a very moralistic understanding of syphilis and was very judgmental in his thoughts about it. Particularly, he attributed the disease to sex workers who, as you can see, these are some choice quotes from his early writings where he calls them uncontrolled spreaders of infection, a menace to the community, etc. When he first arrived in Hot Springs, his idea, which was the kind of commonly accepted wisdom at the time, was that if you want to stop and reduce the spread of syphilis, you have to declare war on brothels, on the industry of organized prostitution. And so that's where his efforts began. And he thought that he had a big task in front of him because, as most commentators knew from the 1920s and 30s, Hot Springs had a reputation as being a fairly wide open city in terms of gambling, in terms of being a place where you could go to drink in the era of Prohibition, and also where, as we see from this quote, prostitution went unmolested. And so Wenger came to Hot Springs and he had this grand mission of eradicating organized prostitution as a solution to the country's VD problems. But that did not work out. It did not go very well for him because over the course of time, he came to learn that there was much more to this story than he thought. He realized that a lot of the individuals who came to Hot Springs, sex workers and others, were there because of dire economic need. They were driven into these circumstances as a result of poverty, particularly during the Great Depression. And so Wenger, over time, came to have a much more sympathetic view toward the women he treated in the clinic in particular, as you can see from that bottom quote on the screen, where he one point said, "It is hard to be chaste and hungry at the same time." He came to see these people eventually as worthy and deserving of treatment, same way anyone else was. And he devoted a lot of his later analysis to the economics of VD. Again, you can see from these quotes here that over time, Wenger comes to see the clinic's patients as unfortunate people who have really dire needs that the government has a duty to care for and look after. He also his views on race, argue, also evolved considerably to the point where, again, he takes a very kind of economic and class-centered look at things over time, realizing that there is really actually no difference between black and white in particular in terms of the incidence of the infection. So when he came to Hot Springs, as I said, he had all of these grand plans, and then things kind of took a different direction because of the interactions he had with people at the clinic. He also, at the start of things, wanted Hot Springs to be a kind of medical research facility, but he found that he was not really able to do any studies because one of the problems he encountered is that people often did not have the financial wherewithal to stay in Hot Springs long enough to receive a course of treatment, which at the time, before the invention of penicillin, treatment process was very lengthy, sometimes lasting up to half a year or even longer. And so with patients leaving before he could successfully enroll them in any kind of medical study, he found that that enterprise, the research enterprise he envisioned, kind of fell apart. Over time, so what he decides to do as he gets this more kind of economically centered analysis of syphilis is realizing that actually the government needs to do things to provide not just medical care, but other kinds of care as well, particularly room and board. And so in the mid 1930s, he was able to establish a program where those who came to Hot Springs were able to receive free room and board in one of the city's hotels. That was the first step. And as you can see from this graph right here, it had a noticeable impact in terms of the number of treatments that patients were able to receive. It increases notably from 1933 onward. Eventually, he expanded on this program, but it was not something that he was able to do kind of on his own as he wished because there was a lot of resistance to those efforts within Hot Springs itself. There's just one excerpt here on the screen of a quote from a judge who in 1934 really let Wenger have it, saying that this was not something that the federal government should be doing. Inviting the scum of the earth to Hot Springs, he argued, was giving the city a bad reputation. Eventually, Wenger did prevail, and for 2 years before he left, he was able to establish a site specifically devoted to the care of syphilis patients. So in beyond just giving them room and board in local hotels, he established a site called Camp Garraday, which was another housing option for people coming into Hot Springs to be treated for syphilis. And again, this is something that probably would not have happened without the pressures placed on people like Wenger by individuals coming from all across the country in need of not just treatment, not just a therapeutic response to syphilis, but also some more basic level of financial security. By the time Wenger left in 1936, the city's reputation and its relationship with syphilis were starting to change. Penicillin finally was something that kind of put the nail in the coffin of Hot Springs, at least in terms of its history as a health resort and as the mecca of the American syphilitic. But hopefully, as that example shows, there's a lot more to uncover in terms of the federal government's involvement and in terms of the experiences of everyday individuals with syphilis as well. So I'll stop there, and I think we can probably turn it over to questions.
And maybe to spark a little bit of discussion. So Hot Springs wasn't the only place in the United States with hot springs. You had Saratoga Springs up in New York, you had Warm Springs up in Virginia. Why do you think that hot springs became the mecca for syphilitics?
That's a really interesting question. I should point out to start that Hot Springs was not the only place in the country that people would go to be treated for syphilis. There were other hot springs. Uh, for those, more locally available, it would be a good option. Um, there's a famous one in Minnesota where we also know people went to be treated for syphilis. But I think part of what really solidified Hot Springs' reputation there was the fact that local city boosters, entrepreneurs, medical professionals did a really good job connecting what the city offered to the kind of broader cultural idea of syphilis. At the time, the disease was known as the wages of sin. It was thought to be a punishment for sexual immorality. And that was something that we know, that stigma of syphilis, had a big impact on individuals who experienced the disease, right? That was actually one of the reasons that they were often driven out of their local communities and maybe local places of medical care because they just didn't have access to the kinds of treatments given the stigma. Uh, Entrepreneurs in Hot Springs, kind of cognizant of the fact that there was this kind of prevailing moral religious understanding of syphilis, were able to kind of take that and exploit it in ways that helped the town. For example, they used a lot of religious imagery when promoting the city. They would talk about it as a place that God had specially set aside for the cure of various ailments. And I think that that was intentional. That message was meant to appeal to people who had syphilis in particular because they were thinking about the disease in those terms anyway. And so that kind of marketing or that connection to Hot Springs as a place where you could come and experience relief that was sent by the Almighty Himself. I think that was something that clearly resonated with a lot of people who had syphilis. Um, Obviously, another contributing factor is the reports in the medical literature of people experiencing significant relief of symptoms from bathing in the hot waters themselves. But I don't think we can overlook the importance of that kind of cultural dimension to this whole thing.
Later on, well, I guess not even later on, in the early part of Hot Springs in the 1870s, 1880s, and further on, drumming became a practice in Hot Springs, especially when the train, the Diamond Joe Railroad from Malvern over to Hot Springs came into existence in the 1870s. And drummers would sort of befriend people on trains and sort of bring them to specific hotels, specific bathhouses, and then overcharge them. Do you think how did the practice of drumming influence the treatment of patients at Hot Springs?
Yeah, that was a really popular practice, particularly in the early part of Hot Springs history. As you said, the 1870s, the 1880s. Even some of the patient narratives that I came across, like this one from Archie Cowles, the gentleman from Cleveland, mentioned it on the train ride into Hot Springs, being approached by representatives of hotels, representatives of doctor's office, saying, "Hey, why don't you come to us when you get to Hot Springs? We'll set you up with what you need. We'll give you the cure we need. We've got the best establishments, etc." And in a lot of cases, this is true for Cowles especially, that was very antagonizing. It was not something that was widely viewed to be ethical or respectable in any way. And when Cowles has this line about if he had his way, he would shoot 90% of the blankety blank doctors, he is referencing the practicing of drumming because he finds it so hideous and vile. But it was clearly there from the start. It was one of the things that the organized medical professionals in Hot Springs, as the city was gathering this reputation, actively tried to stamp out through legislation, through refusing to partner with hotels that were involved in drumming in particular. And over time, that practice did decline as a result of the influence of the local medical profession just refusing to engage in drumming. Um, the federal government also got very involved in trying to stamp it out in the early 20th century. I think, in terms of your question, it did have an influence, though, that was lasting, because a lot of the cures that people went to hot springs for, it was not just the baths. There were a lot of very local, popular kind of patent medicine VD nostrums that were used and widely available to people who were there. Some were homegrown remedies, right? There were companies based out of Hot Springs that offered these products. And those were also subject to investigation by licensed medical men and the federal government later on. But some had a clear preference for those kinds of treatments. I mean, Cowles himself, when he's in Hot Springs, he talks about using them to see what they're, if they might have any beneficial impacts. The predominant treatment of choice at this time was mercury. And, as a toxic metal substance, mercury is something that had all kinds of negative effects on patients, even if it did alleviate some of the symptoms of the disease. And even if used in combination with the near boiling waters of hot springs, it provided some relief. There were a lot of people who did not want to go anywhere near that treatment option. And so hot springs offering these alternatives to that, it's both another reason that the site became so popular, but it's also, I think, shows some of the lasting influences of this whole kind of drumming practice and the associated patent medicine industry.
Yeah, I think that there was, yes, Joe.
Follow up on that line for a second. As our speaker referenced. I'm a fellow historian. Mercury is a poison. It has terrible effects on the nervous system. Question, did it ever, I know historically, for centuries it was used as a syphilis remedy. Did it actually cure syphilis?
Not in the modern sense of the term cure.
It alleviated symptoms.
When we talk about, cure today in our era of antibiotics, right, we're talking about treatments that go to the root of the disease. So in the case of a infectious malady, getting right at the bacteria that causes it and killing it. Mercury could not do that, right? At best, one of the things it could do was alleviate pain. So it was kind of a palliative, I guess, if you want to call it that. But it was harsh in its impacts and effects, as was the treatment that eventually replaced mercury before we get to penicillin, which is a remedy called salvarsan, which is also a poison. It's based on arsenic.
Super. So next, just my last question along this line. Did the mercury applications do what earlier mercury medicines did, like chamomile in the 19th century? Did it often have terrible after effects for people?
Yes, definitely. And we can see that in the data from Hot Springs itself. A lot of people talk about some of the terrible mental effects of receiving mercury in particular. You know, as a toxin that builds up over time in the body, if you're receiving repeated treatments, it can have impacts on the nervous system, not just physical health. You know, one of the things that I discovered in the process of doing my research was that this gentleman here, Michael J. Murphy, the individual from Florida, uh, it seems like treatment with mercury played a role in the intense agony that he was going through, both physically and mentally, and may have, in some sense, contributed to the decision he made to take his life.
Elliot, on the mercury, you mentioned that some of the patients didn't want to go that route, to go the mercury route. In those cases, obviously that's the one, the free clinic is they promoted or they use the mercury treatment for the syphilitic patients. Did they promote any other treatments or like hydrotherapy or anything like that? Or did they just strictly stick with Sulverson and mercury?
Yeah, by the time the clinic came along in 1921, mercury was losing its reputation as the preferred first option of treatment. Salvarsan, the arsenical compound, was invented in 1910, and by the 1920s, particularly during World War I, it had achieved widespread acceptance within hot springs and elsewhere. So that was what Wenger's doctors were using primarily at the clinic. As I said before, also not without its problems. But yes, to your question, there was a lot of interest in studying the impacts of hydrotherapy on patients. The federal government was very interested in doing studies that would compare patients who had just received injections of Salvarsan to those who had a kind of water-only treatment. And part of the reason for that is that, you know, in the 1920s and the 1930s, one of the things I didn't mention is that, like, as the federal government becomes more involved in providing care for syphilis, the city's local medical professionals have to respond because a lot of them view the presence of the federal government and Wenger's clinic as a threat to their livelihoods. And one of the ways that they respond, interestingly, is by uh, becoming promoters of hydrotherapy in ways that they never had before. A lot of them have very negative thoughts about Salvarsan and other drug-based treatments. They kind of pivot out of that market into a kind of hydrotherapeutic environment. Um, and that the federal government's, you know, kind of willingness to test out that therapy is in part response to what they saw local professionals doing within Hot Springs itself. So yeah, they were very interested up to a point. And I say up to a point because, you know, one of the things that Wenger and the federal government always wanted to do was use Hot Springs as a kind of national laboratory. They wanted to, because they had this huge volume of patients, right? Their thought was, okay, we can use hot springs to figure out the best practices in the care of this disease that we can then scale up and export throughout the country in other clinics and other doctors' offices. So they were somewhat averse to the idea of Hot Springs having something unique, because if Hot Springs has something unique, you cannot replicate it. And so that's where the tension was, and that's why they never endorsed a water cure approach to syphilis wholeheartedly, even if they were willing to study it, because they were wary of promoting something that could not be easily adapted in other cities across the country. So there was kind of a lukewarm endorsement and experimentation with it, but never kind of a full-throated approach like the city's medical professionals did.
Hot Springs really became it really sort of gained its prominence, probably reached its peak in the 1910s, 1920s, early 1930s. But there were people visiting the hot springs all the way back to in 1804 when Hunter and Dunbar expedition came through, and there were people
Right,
at
right.
hot springs. And so there were all these bathhouses, rudimentary bathhouses that built up during that time. And it wasn't until like the 1880s, Hot Springs became on National Reservation in 1832. And then later in the 1880s, in the early 1900s, the government came in and started building up the infrastructure in Hot Springs. You had the first Army Navy hospital in the 1880s. You had the covering up of the spring on Central Avenue, which made it easier to cross the street. So was Hot Springs already on its way to becoming a health tourism spot before the government did all this infrastructure work? Or did that push the city in that direction, that infrastructure push it in that direction?
You know, that's interesting. Yeah, the role of the federal government in particular, did it kind of set Hot Springs on a different course? You're right that dating back to the early 1800s, there are a lot of records of people going to, get treatment at the site of hot springs, right? For lots of different diseases, rheumatism, paralysis. Um, my guess is that and it is a guess, I don't know for sure. It's kind of hypothetical. Um, Probably the city would not have gained the reputation it had as specifically a place for syphilis treatment without the interest in the actions of the federal government. Certainly from the 1920s onward, the presence of the only federally run free VD clinic in the country. It was very much a test case. That really sent the message to people anywhere in the US that Hot Springs was the place you needed to be if you had syphilis. Um, and that reputation only expanded with the onset of the Great Depression. So absent that, my sense is there probably would have still been a local medical profession that specialized in the treatment of syphilis. There probably would have still been this vast industry of patent medicine providers offering cures for the disease. Uh, but I don't think it would have developed in quite the same way.
Well, and what I find interesting also is in the 20s, especially teens and 20s, Hot Springs almost became like a family destination because you had these family attractions that grew up in Hot Springs. You had Happy
Right.
Hollow, the photograph, sort of prop photograph place. You had a wax museum that appeared on Central Avenue. You had the petting zoo, the alligator farm, and all that. So it's interesting that you would have sort of these family vacation destinations
Right.
alongside the arthritis and the syphilis and all that, people coming for that.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, and even if you look at the, the records of the local medical profession, uh, there's a real fear among some of them in the 19 teens, particularly after the invention of Salvarsan, after World War One, that their therapeutic livelihoods are going to be wiped out by these new cures. And their response to that is, okay, we've got to thing that maintains the city's reputation as the mecca of the American syphilitic, and that's when they start pivoting toward it's the water. Like that is the key. You don't even need any drugs at all. You just come here and you get that treatment. So, I mean, to your previous question as well, I think that they also kind of played a role in keeping this alive. But you're right. There is a potential history of this city's relationship with syphilis that ends in 1910 or so. The fact that it did not, I think, is attributable both to the actions of the federal government and to the city's medical professionals who continued to find a way to keep people coming to the city for treatment.
Right. Just one more question before I turn it back over to Danielle. In the research of your book, and I know this has been a few years now when you did the research for the book and the book came out, what was the most surprising discovery that you made when researching the treatment of syphilis in Hot Springs? Was there something that really surprised you?
Yeah, there was. I mean, if you look at the historical scholarship on this topic, one of the prevailing views is that because of the huge influence that morality had on ideas about the disease, there is this sense, and I think I have a quote here somewhere in the presentation. Yeah. So this is from one of the most famous accounts of venereal disease in the U.S. from Alan Brandt in a book that first came out in the 1980s. And it's kind of like the Bible of historical literature on the topic. You know, one of the things that he says, and I've got it right there in the quote, is that therapeutic approaches to this problem of sexually transmitted diseases have become secondary to moral or religious responses to the disease. And what surprised me in my research was that was not necessarily the whole story. It's not that there was a battle between kind of a moral response to syphilis and a medical response to syphilis. It's that the moral side of things influenced the treatment, right? So, of course, like the idea that syphilis was the wages of sin, it did not stop people from trying to get cures for the disease. They did not, just hide themselves from everyone, become a recluse, and die in private misery, right? Like they were actively trying to do something to feel better, to get better. It's that the options that they had available to them and the treatments that they partook of uh, showed the heavy influence of the era's moral code. And so, I would say instead of it being kind of a battle between morality and medicine, one of the surprising things that I find is that those two frameworks or those two approaches often overlapped and influenced each other in really interesting ways. So instead of there being this dichotomy between a more scientific view of syphilis and a more religious view of syphilis, it's what I found was that there's a lot of intersection and interplay between those two different approaches.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Danielle.
We'll take a few questions before we close. I'm gonna start with Zoom because there's one in there, and then we'll go to the in-person audience to be thinking of your questions. Kathleen asks, given your comments about how the relief was portrayed as God-given, did you find anything on how these local churches viewed those patients? Would they have been welcomed in worship services, events, or was there fear of general contagion similar to the beginning of the AIDS epidemic? They're also wondering, in a more general sense, how the locals responded to the more commercial aspects of the disease.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know specifically about local churches. Um, One thing that I do know, talking about kind of the religious dimension of the disease and how that factored into its treatment, faith healers were very common in hot springs, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. We have records from patient narratives of people like Archie Cowles from Cleveland, talking about going up to some of these very famous faith healers who sometimes traveled the entire country and seeing what they could offer and what their whole pitch was. So that was definitely part of the therapeutic landscape. I'm not sure to the extent to which that connected to churches very much. On the broader scale, I think what we find from the reception and the reaction of local community is it varies over time, and there's a mix of opinions. There are some who welcomed individuals with syphilis into the community because they felt that they had a duty to care for them. In the case of Archie Cowles, he sometimes found people locally who would loan him money, who would welcome him into their homes, um, in a way that built a kind of destigmatizing environment within the town itself. I think that the presence of so many people with syphilis, to a certain extent, helped normalize the idea of the disease within the town, which allowed for a much more kind of compassionate response. Up to a point and at certain times. In the 1930s, I think, especially as the VD clinic that Wenger set up is overwhelmed with patients. I mean, so many of them that they cannot really provide any adequate care at all. I think at that point, uh, things change and these newcomers, become viewed as a menace, a threat, as something that is sullying the town's reputation at a time in which Hot Springs is struggling itself because of the financial hit of the Great Depression. And in that context, there's a lot of opposition to the presence of so many people with syphilis in the city. But it kind of varies by era and in terms of who you're talking about as well. There are certain people, who looked at it as a financial reward or a bonus because you have, a greater clientele of people in your hotels, for example. But that wasn't the only way of looking at it.
Thanks so much. Do we have any questions from the in-person audience? All right. Oh, Dr. Jessica.
Hi, I have a question about your methods and specifically how you decided to reveal the personal data of the patients. I'm assuming there was some process in that, right? You're using personal documents of people who maybe did not want the world to know that they were the patients, and you also use some medical records. So would you reflect on that?
Yeah. The correspondence that I used, to be clear, in the case of Archie Cowles and this gentleman from Florida, Michael J. Murphy, those are both published accounts. So they are already available in a public form. They had been prepared by family members of those individuals for publication, and I actually first came across them when I was in Hot Springs itself at the National Park Service archives. So for those cases, they're being already in the public domain, didn't introduce any kind of unique kind of ethical considerations from a methodological perspective. In terms of the case studies and the clinical case files, the process that I went through was corresponding with individuals at the archives who knew about the Army and Navy General Hospital, and also working in tandem with the publisher of the book, Johns Hopkins University, to make sure that everything was above board and that we had clearance to, for example, reprint people's names.
I think we have time for one more question. Anybody has anything? Yeah.
Can you see a through line to 100 years later on the medical contours of Garland County or the demographics of Garland County or anything else sociologically, politically, historically that results from this fascinating story?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've not really had time yet to research what some of those long-term outcomes or implications might be. Um, I think there are certainly lessons that Hot Springs offers to us today, particularly in our continued efforts to reduce the stigma associated with sexually transmitted diseases. I think there are stories from that time to speak to where we are now, because a lot of the fundamental problems have not changed that much over the course of 100 years or so. Particularly what I was saying earlier about the normalization of the disease and the creation of relatively stigma-free environments is something that we could look back to and maybe find some innovative solutions for our own day and age. But in terms of, yeah, the continuities or further kind of down the road developments, I'm not exactly sure how hot springs would factor into what we're dealing with today. So
I thought it was off, but it's maybe just dying. It has a red light on it. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bowen. If we want to give him a round of applause.
yeah, thank you everyone. It was really great. It was a tremendous conversation, and thank you for the invitation again.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks to everyone for joining us at today's Legacies and Lunch. If you want to support programs like this, please donate to the Butler Center's programming at robertslibrary.org. And again, please join us in the new year at the Dara Center on the 5th floor of Cal's main library, Wednesday, January 7th from 12 to 1 to hear from Charles Field about his book, Field Notes on Little Rock, History and Memoir, 1622 to 2024. He is waving it in the air. And we have, shamelessly waving it in the air, and we have one more raffle for Dr. Bowen's wonderful book, and the last 3 numbers are 192. Nobody? Maybe they had to. Oh, was it? Wow. Okay. Whoops. 197. Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.